Here we have Mike McHargue, also known as Science Mike. Yeah, you've embraced it.
Hesitantly.
Okay, then just Mike McHargue today. He's the author of this book, Finding God in the Waves. He is also a co-host on the Liturgist podcast. What else are you doing lately?
I host the podcast Ask Science Mike,
right.
Hence the namesake. And I'm on tour, so I'm going spot to spot to talk to people about their relationship with God and how that relates to a scientific worldview.
If you could open us up with maybe 10 minutes or so on who, I think the list was, who the hell is Science Mike?
Who the hell is Science Mike? So I, through some twist of fate, do this for a living, go to rooms and talk to people. And I'm always super self-conscious. Have you heard of imposter syndrome? Yeah, I'm like the master of imposter syndrome, because with a stage name like Science Mike, the expectations are all wrong. So I'm going to start with like the fine print legalese. You know, people like get mad about Bill Nye being called Bill Nye the Science Guy because he's just an engineer. Well, I went to community college for 6 weeks, so I don't have an engineering education background. So why am I called Science Mike? A friend of mine called me Science Mike at a party as a joke, and it stuck. So like my relationship with science and science education is very similar to like a football fan that loves NFL football. They don't play football. They might actually be a terrible football player, but they know the names of the quarterbacks and the rules of the game. That's me with science. I have an odd ability to read and retain information. That's my entire trick. Now, I also talk about spirituality a lot, so people might think, oh, well, he's a pastor. Well, not exactly. I was ordained as a deacon in the Southern Baptist Church, but that is no longer a valid ordination since I got thrown out of the denomination. So I have no qualifications whatsoever, and you've wasted your lunch break today.
Just lost 30% of the audience here.
So the reason I have any people listening to my show and reading the book is experiential. I have lived a very common tale in Western society. I grew up deeply religious, and in my case, experienced what I felt was a close personal relationship with God, and had a crisis in life that led me to examine my faith, and I became an atheist. I was an atheist for a couple of years, and then I had an absolutely insane mystical experience where I felt like I was in the presence of God. And it sounds like one of those Christian movies they make in South Georgia and play only in churches. But instead of like a happily ever after, and he became a missionary, as someone who had accepted a skeptical scientific worldview, my response to meeting God was to ask a neurologist for a CAT scan because I was 100% certain I had a brain tumor. So my life is about living out this tension of understanding the world through a primarily scientific lens, but also having these moments of profound beauty and mystery and trying to figure out what to do with them. So I tell people my favorite theologian is Carl Sagan. You know, I probably understand God much more similarly to Einstein or Spinoza than to many of my more conventionally Christian brethren. But I'm a person just trying to figure it out. And it turns out there are millions of people in America today who both think the idea of God is kind of absurd and deeply fascinating. That's the tension, the crossroads that we find ourselves in. And so basically I travel around the country as kind of a low-rent combination of Bill Nye and Fred Rogers, saying we can look at the world scientifically and it's beautiful and you're special and you're okay. And that's all I'm about. And so I've gone from, you know, kind of working in advertising and starting tech companies and selling them to being an author and a podcaster. It's been a really strange journey. And hopefully by the time we get done here today, you won't have felt like it was an utter waste of time because we may get into some areas where you in your own life have found that Christians expect you to accept too much bullshit, but atheists might disregard some experiences that are near and dear to you in your life. So we're going to try to embody kind of a middle space today.
Okay. One of the foundations of you sort of coming back to a relationship with your faith was sort of establishing some baselines for yourself. You call those your axioms. Do you think you could give us a couple of those and help us understand what that did for you?
Sure. So I had this moment in 2012 where I felt like I was face to face with God. I was a really bullied kid. I was a nerd, really into computer programming. No one here can probably relate to that. But like in the 80s, like wear Hawaiian shirts, really into computer programming, kind of a beast with red hair. It's not the recipe for popularity, right? So kids made fun of me all the time. And the way I kind of found any psychological relief from the wounds and anger that came to me from bullying was to be a 7 and 8-year-old kid who prayed every day, right? Because Jesus would listen and Jesus loved me. If you haven't grown up in an evangelical context, the idea that small children are told they can talk to God and God listens and God loves them, that sounds strange. But for me, it's literally the reason I didn't walk onto campus with a gun, right? It was the way I survived school. And to lose God for me was a tremendous grief. And it was only like when I decided I was free from my old illusions about God, that I no longer longed to God, that I had this experience with a God I no longer believed in, where I was standing on a beach late at night and I saw a bright light, like literally like a glowing light in the air in front of me, and the light moved toward me and it surrounded me, and I felt God's love for me, and then I felt God's love for all of humanity and probably even all life that exists. It was profound and it was moving. But there's a reason atheists and skeptics aren't convinced by those kinds of stories, right? They're very powerful to you, but a lot of people see bright lights or burning bushes or whatever, and then they make claims about God that contradict each other. So compared to science, where we examine a claim and then we see how much evidence we have to support that claim, through observation, through experiment, to put confidence in the idea, religious people tend to say, God told me, end of discussion. So even after I'd had an experience, I think that's probably as personally moving and powerful as anyone has had in history, I couldn't let go and shouldn't have let go of the idea that this doesn't empirically prove anything about God. Just because I saw a light doesn't mean things written in any set of scriptures are true. Are you with me? Does that make sense? So this put me in this very strange space where I had this longing to experience God like I used to, but I didn't want to accept a bunch of ideas without justification and become something I'd grown out of again. So I learned about axiomatic thinking, self-justified statements. Now you can have axioms in logic that are very formal, or you can have axioms in philosophy that are much less structured. And so my idea was, what can I learn about God that I can prove? No, you can only prove in math. That I can support empirically. That was my goal. And this wasn't to write a blog post. This was so I didn't feel like a 38-year-old man waiting to see Santa Claus every time I tried to pray. Like, can I accept something for myself? And when I would try to read theology books or scriptures about God, it tended to make me feel deeply skeptical toward my own experience. So I started studying a lot of cosmology and a lot of particle physics, trying to look for, like a basic claim most religions make about God is that God created everything and keeps it going. And is there room for something like that in physics? And I'm not talking about what atheists might call the God of the gaps. We're pushing God to what we don't understand in science. I was looking for what we did understand in science. And I found kind of a physics deism, where if you look at the way the universe is structured and primarily understood in cosmology as emerging from a singularity. If God in theology is said to be the source of all things, in physics we would point to the singularity as being that actual source. And when you apply relativity to the amount of compression, gravitational compression, that happened with space-time at singularity, strange things happen. Now, we're trying to get better models for that state than we currently have. But at least in relativity, you see a unifying of the four fundamental forces of physics. You see potentially the elimination of causality and temporality. And you see basically a state of unity with the potential to create all that there is. And that sounded very divine to me. And then God is also said to be not just what created everything, but what sustains everything. Well, we know what keeps the universe going. It operates on a set of rules. It's just physics. And so I was very comfortable using the word God in the way that Einstein would use the word God. Einstein didn't believe in a personal God, a God with consciousness or being or agency, but Einstein was comfortable calling the grandeur of physical reality God, the wonder we experience, not only looking through a telescope, but probing the universe with mathematics. The trouble for me with that idea of God was that it didn't provide any justification for a God I could pray to, or love, or experience. And I felt like I kind of hit a dead end. And remember, the whole reason I'm going on this investigation is what? So I don't feel like an idiot if I pray. And so I started studying what I thought was probably the most likely source for personalized God experiences, human brains, neuroscience. Like, I love, neuroscience is my favorite science because it's the only science where something studies itself. It's really referential and very meta because human brains are studying human brains, which is a head trip if you think about it for a minute. And as an atheist, people would use the fact that you can describe many religious experiences with neurology and neuroscience dismissively. But I was reading a neuroscience text one day, and they were talking about the formation of love in the human brain. And no one dismisses love as meaningless because it is a primarily neurological phenomenon. We love love. We love to be in love. We love to experience love, even if love is not some objective facet of material reality. So I started to approach a personal God as something that emerged primarily from the fabric of human consciousness, the brain. And when I kind of arrived at that point and realized that in many cases, cognitive and behavioral sciences tell us that the practice of religious faith can be healthy and helpful for individuals and for societies, I kind of phrased that as a phrase that I could repeat to myself if I started to pray and felt like an idiot. And the early one was something like, God is at least the set of forces that created and sustained the universe as experienced via a psychosocial model rooted in evolved features of human brains. And even if that's all God is, sustaining such a belief can increase empathy, personal health, and generosity. So, and the idea there, even if, I was going for a minimum idea, but admitting it might not be complete, probably wasn't complete, which I'm comfortable with because we make assumptions about the universe and quantum mechanics that don't incorporate gravity. simply because there are things we don't understand yet. So I was attempting to make a scientifically rigorous theology, which ended up on the one hand being basically heresy to most Christian churches, but to me, deeply comforting. Deeply comforting. So I made axioms for God and for prayer and for the church and for Jesus, all for my own personal well-being, all so that I could place myself in a tradition of faith that I valued called Christianity. And some years after I wrote these down for myself, I met someone who was struggling through a very similar faith story that I'd had, growing up in a very conservative evangelical context, and then getting to the end of that rope. And I told him my story in solidarity and told him my axioms just in case they were helpful, and he got really excited about them. And you know, I debated even putting those axioms in the book at all because they're super nerdy. Like, they're just not, you know, I mean, when you write a book, you're trying to create a narrative arc that people can pick up, they can learn, but they can also live into. That's the power of storytelling. But I found that for so many of us, Western thinking is so powerful for making telescopes and Android phones. You know, this, like, at the bottom line, what's the data say, is so useful for learning about the world and for building things. But many social scientists and cognitive scientists argue that we've really idolized one particular way of viewing reality using the human brain, that we've created an incredible emphasis on a left brain, prefrontal cortex way of relating to the world. And what art and music and religion can do is help remind us that there's also a holistic, more right hemisphere way of approaching material reality that has nothing to do with fact claims and everything to do with the beauty of a sunrise. And it's in that spirit these axioms are meant to help people explore that type of right-brained spirituality.
So you talked a little bit about prayer, you talked about the CAT scan you wanted after your experience. What happens in our brains when we pray or when we worship?
So that's, I mean, that's why I call myself a Christian again, was reading many, many studies about prayer. So when I started researching about prayer, the first thing you find in prayer studies is what? Like, prayer doesn't really work. In scientific studies, it's been repeatedly documented. Like, if you take a group of patients and you have a control group that no one is praying for, and you have a second group where people are praying for them but they don't know it, and they have a third group where people are praying for them and they know it, the group with the lowest recovery rate is group 3. They recover slightly less often than the other two groups, and although the researchers didn't want to assign causality, they conjectured that that could possibly be a performance anxiety. That people are so stressed about wanting to get better because they don't want to let their friends and family down, that it actually makes it harder for them to get better. And that is one of the things that led me out of my faith, was reading that study, because what? My entire faith practice and belief was based on prayer. But when you study instead of the material effects on external reality of prayer, if in neuroscience you instead turn the lens back toward the individual, a completely different picture of prayer emerges. So when people pray to a God they believe is primarily loving, that's a big caveat. If you believe God is primarily wrathful or vengeful or full of justice, the effects on your brain are different and arguably detrimental. But if you pray to a God that's loving, studies have shown that you get increased activity in your anterior cingulate cortex, which based on a combination of brain imaging studies and behavioral studies, neuroscientists associate the anterior cingulate cortex with like compassion and empathy. Also in the prefrontal cortex, you see a lot of increased activity. That's the part of the brain we largely associate with agency and focus and has a high association with consciousness. And when people pray often, not only do they have elevated activities in those regions, some studies have shown actually an increased growth or development in gray matter in those parts of the brain. Simultaneously, you see a reduction in activity in the brain's amygdala, which is largely associated with fear and anger. So when people pray regularly to a God they believe is loving, they become less likely to become angry over the same amount of stimulus and more likely to respond compassionately. They tend to have lower blood pressure. They tend to find it easier to forgive themselves and forgive other people. They tend to be less fearful of outsiders, which has no relevance in 2017. But it's a process that is transformative in your subjective experience of reality. Well, who cares? That's just therapeutic. It manifests itself in your lived behaviors, and because of that, can be beneficial across cultures and societies. And so I remember reading that, and I started running around my house shouting because I was so excited. And my wife was like, "What happened?" And I was like, "Prayer increases activity in your anterior cingulate cortex." And she was not as excited as I was. But like we live in a culture where if the data doesn't support the practice, we're not interested, right? Like how many decisions are made in companies today where they say, let's look at the data and see what it says. And so for a performance-oriented culture, I found it deeply affirming that not only did I enjoy prayer, but you could make a great scientific argument that it was good for me and good for my role in society.
All right. Let's get nerdy. Are you ready?
All the time.
All right. So let's talk multiverse.
Okay.
What do you? Tell us a little bit about the multiverse, and then what do you think it says about God's character, his creativity, or whatever that the multiverse, if we accepted that thesis?
So, as someone who loves science, the multiverse is one of the most kicked around and abused concepts in science. Because first of all, there is no one idea about the multiverse in science. When we talk about multiverse cosmology or multiple universes, we're talking about attempts to reconcile some troubling attributes in the standard model of physics. And a famous quote about a problem with the standard model is from Albert Einstein, who said, "God does not play dice." There's this problem that the way we make predictions at very small scales is to run models over and over and over and probabilistically ascribe what could happen. For people who are determinists, who believe that the universe follows predictable rules, that ambiguity in the standard model of physics is frustrating. So one of the most commonly understood multiverse models is an attempt to resolve that tension, and it's the many worlds hypothesis of quantum dynamics, which basically says the reason there's all these probabilities is because they all occur. Everything that can happen on the quantum level does, and the universe as you experience is simply one thread that weaves through these probabilities. We have absolutely no ability to prove or disprove the quantum many worlds hypothesis today, and so we have to demote the multiverse from the lofty perch that more understood or more accepted cosmological models hold. Even though it has like all this popular attention, it's almost more like a scientifically informed philosophy today than a proper hypothesis. You see what I mean? And we also have to understand no cosmological model predicts multiple universes. A universe is everything that exists. So when we talk about multiple universes, what we're talking about is multiple observable universes. There's another many worlds hypothesis that basically says if space as we understand it is spatially infinite, that it extends in forever in all three dimensions, then there are multiple observable universes in the normal universe of physics. Because since the Big Bang, there's only been so much time for light to transmit information. So something is further away in the universe, say 100 billion light years away, there hasn't been time since the universe was born for us to have information about it or it to have information about us. But if you run probability, any multiverse theory tends to say things we intuitively hold impossible become probable, right? Because if the standard model is probability-based, things that are very unlikely in a spatially infinite universe just happen. They just happen less often. And I think for like really conventional ideas about God, this is deeply troubling. Because if God has a plan for humanity, which humanity does the plan play out for? Like you could imagine in a many worlds hypothesis where there are multiple versions of me, some of which believe in Christ and some don't. And if your theology is based on people who believe the right things about Jesus go to heaven, and people who believe the wrong things about Jesus go to hell, you start to wonder, so like, are there infinite variations of me? And are there like tens of billions of me in heaven and tens of billions of me in hell? Or are there like multiple dimensions of heaven and hell for each quantum reality? Isn't that really wasteful for God? And I think the whole problem with this line of thinking is we take theologies which were meant to help us understand God in a 500 BC or 3000 BC or 100 AD context and try to use them to explain cosmology today. For someone like me, the many worlds hypothesis is not troubling at all for how I view God. Because remember what we talked about a few minutes ago. What's God? How we understand physics. So that's just the mechanism by which the miracle of my life and the fact that I can be on Google's campus today talking to all of you, the fact that 2 days ago I sat down for breakfast with my daughters and my youngest sang me a song, all those things are cherished mysteries that emerge from that gift we call reality. And I think some religious people get really troubled when I say things like that. It's like, well, your fundamental theology is based on outdated thinking. But to me, that's the beauty of faith. If you look across the arc of the Scripture, you'll actually find that the way people approach God shifts and changes as the dominant cosmologies and worldviews did as well. So the earliest books of the Bible make cosmological assumptions that were normal for that era, but highlighted this God as somehow different. So Genesis, for example, depicts a God who is creative and pleased with creation, in contrast to other creation myths in those days where the gods were indifferent toward or somewhat hostile toward humanity. Where say the universe was birthed out of the battle between two gods as someone's guts were spilled across the sky, and basically the earth is a ball of poop. Which, I mean, if you ever dig in the soil, you can get where they came up with that argument. But it's not like a very elevated view of the relationship between humanity and the divine. But as understandings of the world change, when you saw depictions of God become less personal across cultures in the world and more mysterious, what happened? God moves from a man walking into a garden to a God in a temple, a God whose greatness emanates from one point across all the earth, but has a local area code, right? Because you can only pray to God if you're in the proximity of the temple, which is why we read the Bible through exile. Because if you're not in the local area code, God can't hear you anymore. So if some culture kicked you out of your land, you lament and grieve and want to go home so God can hear you again. Those are two different pictures of God. So for us today to incorporate cosmology into our relationship with the divine, I argue is not heresy, but the most biblical thing you can do.
Okay, so
that was nerdy.
Thank you for fulfilling what I asked there. Why Jesus? Why Christianity then?
Ooh. So I don't know where everybody's mind space is. I've noticed that a lot of people on the West Coast are kind of post-religious. So in the Midwest, everybody's wrestling with is there a God or not? And in Portland, people are like, wait, what's God? There's not atheists in Portland. That would be too big of an emotional investment in the whole idea. So I don't know where the center of gravity is in this room. But I will say if you have a generally skeptical or generally scientific worldview, a common thing emerges in my work. Is people say, okay, I can get why you see awe in the universe and why it's important for you to call that awe God. I understand that. I don't understand why that makes you a Christian, because to be a Christian is to make many more assumptions about God than you seem to be making. So probably the most frequent question I get is that one, why Jesus? Why aren't you just a New Age spiritualist with crystals, or you meditate? Well, atheists meditate. And I can't separate the cultural impact that Christianity has played on how I relate to God. And I think you could make an argument that every Westerner is to some degree a Christian. Because whether they accept or reject God, they are doing so through a lens that originated in a Christian tradition. Take the terms theist and atheist, the default positions in the West. Those are kind of meaningless categories in large swaths of the Eastern world. It implies a dual way of thinking, a reaction to the implications of theism and monotheism specifically that simply aren't present in those cultures. And you can make an argument that atheism is like a Christian denomination. It's spreading from this formational idea in Western thinking. And that means for me to make sense of, to have language for what I'm calling a great mystery, an unknown God, the ritual and language of the Christian church is what gets me there. But more specifically, I alluded to it earlier, but I remember the first news about Columbine, and everyone was so shocked. Everyone said, how could this happen? How could students walk onto campus with a gun? And I remember my first thought was how did this take so long? Because if every day kids stand on your head and pelt you with baseballs and make you eat things out of a mystery bag they brought from home and pull your pants down in front of all the other students, the hurt eventually becomes toxic and turns into an unfulfilled rage. I remember in high school, by some miracle, my metabolism turned on and I was thin for a few years. And I started having friends, which was amazing to have friends at school. I'd never had that happen before. But even in high school, when I had the acceptance of my peers, I would often fantasize, almost daily, about walking on to my campus with a gun. Now, I never thought about shooting other children, but I had vivid fantasies about public suicide because I wanted bullies to understand that there were scars they could not see, that their words and their actions shaped who I am. And I learned in therapy, as you do, that the reason I never did that was an unshakable conviction that Jesus loved me. So whether or not I could make a fact claim to a historical figure of Jesus that was resurrected from the dead, that name is the only way I can know God's love. That name, culturalized, you could make an argument that it is the how an infinite mystery becomes known to me. And because I grew up evangelical, there's this expectation that if you believe in Jesus, the most important thing is to convince literally the rest of the planet to believe the same thing. And I could not be less interested in that enterprise and that pursuit. I couldn't be less interested. I don't know if Jesus was sent to save the world. I just know that literally Jesus saved me. And so that's how I place myself in this fractious feud of a global tradition we call the church.
Mike, you described sort of the baselines, the minimum you're willing to go, whether it's axioms or however. What do you hope for? What do you want to hold on to from your tradition or from others?
Martin Luther King Jr. said, "The moral arc of the universe bends toward justice," which is beautiful and wildly quoted and scientific rubbish. There's no fact claim you could make that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. Where does it fall apart? Step one, moral arc of the universe. Like, what does that mean to Jupiter? What moral act happens on Jupiter? And towards justice, the arc of the universe scientifically bends towards entropic heat death. So imagine...
Not as catchy.
Right, it's not as catchy. I just want you to imagine that speech or talking to the press and saying, the arc of the universe bends toward entropic heat death. How would the fight for racial equality in America have progressed with a scientifically accurate assumption that makes humans feel nihilistic? So what I hope for in my faith is that the completely unfounded assumption that the root of all things is love, I hope it's true. That's what I'm holding out for. Not like a nice house in a subdivision in an eternal kingdom with streets of gold. That's ridiculous. Not political might or power for people who say similar things about God as I do. That's oppressive. But the idea that all this came from love and is ultimately returning to love is the animating energy of my life, which is quite beautiful. Because if if all this came from love, I can't be a person of God and help white supremacy exist. I can't be a person of God and say that men are superior to women. Anything that creates oppression and destruction and distance between people is not of love and is therefore not of God. So it's a ridiculous hope that somehow is quite beautiful and life-changing when you accept it.
You hear me? Thanks for the talk. That's very impressive. I have a question about related to the last part of your speech. So you said you were particularly skeptical before. I mean, you did the research and you found God, and and the question related to you chose Christian. So my question is, when you decided to be a Christian, do you take it all in, like all the Christian culture and the stories that you take, you just overnight you believe in them all, or like you still have some, you hold on to something that you cannot, just don't accept or something?
Yeah, Christianity has a problem. In public, it's primarily understood through the lens of modern American Protestantism. And one of the foundations of modern American Protestantism is that the Bible is literal and that historical accounts in the Bible are modernist depictions of history. The problem is the Bible is not modern literature or modern history. An objective portrayal of factual events, well, A, doesn't exist, but B, the assumption that it was possible wasn't something the ancients thought about. All history was told through the lens of a people's story. So the Bible, which is not a single book, but a library of books, tells over and over and over the story of what? Exile and reconciliation. Why? Because the earliest books of the Bible, as we understand it by archaeologists, were people writing down ancient stories while in exile from their homeland with a longing to return. And so in that text, you have these stories about people what? Making into the land that was promised to them as a sign of God's favor. What's the subtext? What's the social motivation for a story like that? If we are faithful to God, we will get home again. So when I called myself a Christian again, it's not to say that overnight I decided that the earth was at one point literally covered in water and that all of humanity emerged from a single family living on a boat that, by the way, had 2 or 7 of every species of animal on the planet. In a modern perspective, that story is absurd. But I don't read the Bible as a modernist anymore, any more than you would pick up Greek literature and read it with a modern lens. When you read the Bible and look at Christian stories, you have to understand a specific author wrote to a specific audience with a specific agenda. And so what I'm looking for in the Bible is not a series of scientific, historic fact claims, but a 3,500-year conversation and debate about who God is and what that means to us. And in that way, I find all those old Bible stories incredibly instructive and useful, but a terrible way to learn about cosmology or an easy reading of history. But right, historians, when they try to build a historical narrative, you can't trust any ancient historian to just give you a dry telling. That's why there's so much debate in academic histories. People look at multiple cultural sources, multiple artifacts, and then try to build a narrative that helps us understand what happened in the past. And so in that lens, the Bible is certainly useful as one pseudo-historical recording of events. But I believe strongly that you don't have to accept a modernist interpretation of ancient scripture in order to place yourself within Christianity. In fact, some people in the 1st and 3rd centuries would have called that heresy.
So I'm just kind of curious. Well, thank you very much, first of all. In the way you kind of described your faith experience and the way you described God, and then Christianity is the way that you experience God and the way you defined it. I'm just curious what your perspective is or on other faiths and how they play a role in humanity and in our, I guess, in your approach to God.
Yeah, interfaith dialogue is a lot easier for me than it used to be because as a Southern Baptist, my main goal in interfaith dialogue was to convince other people to become Christians so they wouldn't go to hell. And today, interfaith dialogue is listening and understanding how their tradition and their culture have shaped their understanding of God and their lives. I don't actually elevate my tradition above anyone else's at all. But I also think it can be mildly appropriative for me as a American white person to get really into Buddhism and place myself in. I don't say it's impossible, but I'm saying you have to watch out for your motivations and your ability to truly embody a tradition whose origins are based in different philosophies and different epistemologies, and really, frankly, fundamentally different neurological models of processing reality. So yeah, for me, I see all faiths as, if it leads you towards love, then it leads you towards God. And I'm super comfortable with that. Plays really well in the Southeast, by the way, that answer.
I'm from Atlanta.
So over the years, you've asked a ton of questions. And so I was going to ask today or, recently, what's the question that you keep scratching your head about, or as it especially relates to your faith? Or do you feel like you feel comfortable with all your answers, or do you have another question that you feel like you don't really have a good grip on?
I am really comfortable with all my answers because I'm always aware they're probably wrong. So as a Baptist, totally sure I had the whole God thing figured out. Highly, highly certain, which is really emotionally gratifying. Humans have a cognitive bias towards certainty. We're happier when we're confident in our beliefs. So of course, when I stopped believing in God, what did I do? I became a really confident atheist, that I had this whole God thing figured out, only now instead of being true, it's a farce. So I've been fundamentally wrong about the question I most value in life twice in a row. Which means I have a much looser relationship with my worldview than I used to. I don't guard it so jealously. I just try to read and learn and grow and change as I can. With the expectation, there is a huge number of things I'm wrong about, and I just want to figure out as many as I can, with the understanding that my new answer could also be wrong. Now that, for many people, is like unmooring psychologically. So my brain hack is to be highly certain about my uncertainty. Kind of trick my brain into being comfortable in a state of unknowing. I think the question I wrestle with the most right now is, can we as a species really ultimately be altruistic and loving? Is it possible that my belief and my hopefulness that faith and belief can suppress some of our darker impulses, is that actually grounded in reality? Because there's a wave of populism in the West right now riding the back of Christianity into power. So what does it really mean to love your neighbor? And are we capable of it? Is a question I think about far more than any other.
So you mentioned a lot of the benefits of kind of praying. So you talked about the anterior cingulate cortex growing and the amygdala shrinking. You mentioned how things begin and end in love. Do you think that there's any other way to maybe have some of these, I guess, occur without believing in a God? So do you think that religion is the only way to kind of get to, for example, a shared worldview of things beginning and ending in love? Or is it really just through believing in a God?
Yeah, so the kind of exclusivist idea is interesting. When neuroscientists have spent significant effort studying non-religious meditation as well, and you find many of the benefits are very, very similar, especially in regards to focus, concentration, attention, compassion. The primary difference I've seen across literature is it's hard to embody love as a fundamental feature of reality in a non-religious context. You could say that it's a personal tool for transformation. But one of the biggest sort of sticky differences between religious and non-religious meditation is when religious people believe God is loving and focus on that, it becomes foundational in how they process reality. And some neuroscientists have seen that as a characteristic asymmetry in the activity in your thalamus, which is usually highly symmetrical. And they've only seen this asymmetric skewing in religious people. And it's only for people that pray a lot, far more than what I'd call normal. But when people have that amount of altered worldview based on the idea that God is loving, these are people that will often make what objectively is absurd self-sacrifice for others. Because they think even if they're hurt or betrayed or even killed, it doesn't matter because God is working all things toward good. That's a harder belief to embody at that level in a secularized context. But we also understand non-religious contexts and secular thinking can come with their own sets of benefits, especially when it comes to evaluating fact claims. Skeptical thinkers are a lot less likely to fall for the fake news thing because they inherently want to call into question all ideas, and they're skeptical even of things they have affinity towards. So for them, it's almost like a red alert if they like something too much. And that's why I think it's important to partner together in building society as opposed to constantly trying to defeat each other. So if we let some religious people embody this overblown idea of love, but then we, in conversations, civil, political, social, embody the capacity for skeptics to test ideas, the intersection of those ideas will ultimately be better for the world.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about worship. So giving what you feel, and you no longer feel ties to a Southern Baptist tradition or any other tradition. How's that? And I think this would apply to us living in Silicon Valley with, I think, less than 5% say that we go to a place of worship on a weekly basis. So how does that spell out for you? And is there anything that has led to that more mystical or experiential component of the faith?
Yeah, so I'm definitely a mystic. I'm a contemplative. So huge parts of my worship experience are individual, are spending times of silence, spending times of reflection. But I also think the science bears out the idea that some form of corporate or collective worship is deeply beneficial to people of faith. Why? Because some form of collective or corporate organization is beneficial to humans. We're social primates who tend to believe what people around us believe. That's the primary factor in what an individual will accept or reject is their sense of social identity. So I also participate in weekly worship in a corporate setting. I'm a Methodist. I live in the Southeast. Finding a church is really easy. But I think today that can also look like people getting together at their house with a bottle of wine and talking about their hopes and fears and dreams and how they view God. I don't think it matters like the specific context. I think there's pros and cons to every form of liturgical expression. But I do think that it's helpful and gratifying to gather in some form of collective worship. And frankly, I think we're finding that's true for non-religious people too. I mean, there's the Sunday meetings in LA. I'm sure you've heard of this. Like, atheists get together and sing and hear a talk on Sunday mornings because there's something powerful about gathering together, especially in a culture today that has become increasingly socially isolated and isolating.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, everybody.